In the summer of 1942, British tank crews in North Africa began encountering a new and terrifying reality on the battlefield. German armoured forces were deploying tanks whose frontal armour could not be penetrated by any weapon in the British arsenal at combat ranges. The Tiger I, with its massive 88mm gun and frontal armour over 100mm thick, appeared virtually invulnerable to British tank guns and anti-tank weapons. British tanks that had been adequate against earlier German armour found themselves hopelessly outmatched, destroyed at ranges where their own guns were completely ineffective. Intelligence reports from the Eastern Front confirmed that the Soviets were facing similar monsters and that the Germans were developing even heavier armour for future deployment. The Allied armies faced a crisis of capability. If they could not defeat German heavy tanks, how could they hope to win the ground war in Europe? The answer would come from British weapons designers who understood that incremental improvements would not be sufficient, that what was needed was a revolutionary leap in anti-tank firepower. What they created was the most powerful anti-tank gun fielded by any Western Allied nation during World War II, a weapon so large that it pushed the boundaries of what could be considered a towed gun rather than artillery, and so effective that German tank commanders learned to fear its distinctive long barrel, appearing through the smoke of battle. This was the Ordnance Quick-Firing 17-Pounder, and this is the story of the weapon that gave Allied forces the firepower to meet German heavy armour on equal terms, and of the gun crews who served it with courage and deadly precision from the battlefields of Italy to the hedgerows of Normandy to the final advance into Germany. The origins of the 17-Pounder lay in the recognition, earlier than many Allied commanders were willing to admit, that German tank development was outpacing Allied anti-tank capabilities. British weapons designers, studying intelligence reports and examining captured German equipment, concluded by early 1942 that heavier German tanks were inevitable, and that existing British anti-tank guns would be inadequate against them. The standard British anti-tank gun at that time was the 6-Pounder, an excellent weapon by the standards of early war design, but one whose armour penetration was reaching its practical limits. Incremental improvements to the 6-Pounder could not provide the dramatic increase in performance that future operations would require. What was needed was an entirely new weapon, built around a much larger calibre and designed from the beginning to defeat the heaviest armour the Germans could deploy. The design team, working under enormous time pressure and with the knowledge that British forces might soon face invulnerable German tanks, made fundamental decisions that would define the 17-Pounder's character. They chose a calibre of 76.2mm, which in British terminology translated to 17 pounds, referring to the approximate weight of the solid shot projectile. This was a dramatic increase from the 57mm 6-Pounder, providing significantly greater projectile mass and energy. They designed the gun with an extremely long barrel, 55 calibers in length, meaning the barrel was 55 times the bore diameter. This extraordinary length was necessary to achieve the muzzle velocities required for penetrating heavy armour at combat ranges. The result was a gun barrel over 14 feet long, a dimension that would create immediate recognition on any battlefield, and significant challenges in handling and concealment. The development program for the 17-Pounder proceeded at emergency pace, with prototype guns undergoing accelerated testing in late 1942 and production authorised even before all trials were complete. The first production guns left the factories in early 1943, an extraordinarily rapid development cycle that reflected both the urgency of the need and the effectiveness of British weapons design and manufacturing processes under wartime pressure. The gun that emerged was a formidable piece of engineering, weighing just under 3 tons in firing position, requiring a crew of 7 men to operate effectively, and capable of penetrating over 140mm of armour plate at 1,000 yards range with standard armour-piercing shot. This performance was revolutionary, dramatically exceeding any previous Allied anti-tank weapon. The physical presence of the 17-Pounder was striking and unmistakable. The gun sat on a split-trail carriage that could be towed by a vehicle or, in emergencies, manhandled by its crew over short distances. When deployed for firing, the trails were spread to provide a stable platform, and the gun could traverse through a limited arc without repositioning the carriage. The breech mechanism was a vertical sliding block type, allowing rapid loading and firing. The sights were sophisticated for the period, providing accurate range estimation and allowing engagement of targets at distances exceeding 2,000 yards. But it was the barrel that dominated the weapon's appearance. jutting forward like a lance, impossible to mistake for anything but what it was, a gun designed to kill tanks at long range. Operating the 17-pounder required a highly trained and well-coordinated crew working under conditions of extreme stress and danger. The crew consisted of the detachment commander, who directed the gun's employment and selected targets, the layer, who aimed the gun in elevation and traverse, the loader, who handled the ammunition and operated the breech, and 4 ammunition handlers who brought rounds forward from storage, prepared them for loading, and assisted with gun handling. Each crew member had specific responsibilities that had to be executed with precision and speed, as the difference between firing first and being fired upon could determine whether the crew survived the engagement. The tactical employment of the 17-pounder was shaped by both its extraordinary capabilities and its significant limitations. The gun's size and weight made it difficult to conceal and impossible to move quickly once deployed. Its long barrel, while essential for performance, created a distinctive silhouette that experienced German tank commanders learned to recognize instantly. The gun could not be easily repositioned during an engagement, meaning that once it opened fire, the crew was committed to their position until the engagement ended or they were forced to withdraw. These characteristics meant that the 17-pounder was most effective when employed in carefully prepared positions, in ambush situations where the crew could exploit the weapon's long-range accuracy and penetration while minimizing their exposure to return fire. The doctrine that developed around the 17-pounder emphasized the importance of position selection and preparation. Gun crews were taught to identify positions that provided clear fields of fire across likely enemy approach routes, while offering some degree of concealment and protection. Ideally, the gun would be positioned hull down, with only the barrel and shield visible to approaching enemy, making it difficult to spot and even more difficult to hit. The crew would prepare multiple firing positions if time allowed, planning to fire a limited number of rounds from one position before displacing to an alternate position to avoid counter-battery fire. Camouflage was critical. The 17-pounder's size made concealment difficult, but experienced crews became expert at using terrain, vegetation, and camouflage nets to break up the gun's distinctive outline. The 17-pounder's first significant combat employment came during the Italian campaign in 1943, where it proved its worth against German armour in the difficult terrain of the Italian peninsula. The mountainous landscape, with its narrow valleys and limited approach routes, favoured defensive anti-tank tactics, and 17-pounder crews learned to exploit these conditions effectively. They positioned their guns to cover road junctions, bridges and valley approaches, waiting for German armour to enter their killing zones before opening fire. The results were impressive and often devastating. German Panzer IV tanks and even the feared Tiger I found that they could be engaged and destroyed at ranges where British tank guns had previously been ineffective. One engagement from the Italian campaign illustrates the 17-pounder's capabilities and the skill required to employ it effectively. A 17-pounder detachment positioned to cover a valley approach to Allied positions observed German armour advancing in column along a road. The gun commander held fire until the lead vehicle, identified as a Tiger I, reached a point where the road passed through a natural choke point with steep hillsides, preventing the tank from manoeuvring off the road. At a range of approximately 1,400 yards, the layer fired the first shot, an armour-piercing round that struck the Tiger's frontal armour and penetrated, causing catastrophic internal damage and leaving the tank burning and blocking the road. The following German vehicles, unable to bypass the destroyed Tiger, attempted to reverse, but a second shot from the 17-pounder destroyed another tank before the remainder could escape out of the range. The German column withdrew, having learned that the approach was covered by a weapon capable of defeating even their heaviest armour. The invasion of Normandy in June 1944 marked the 17-pounder's introduction to the Northwest European campaign, where it would face its most severe operational test. The close bocage country of Normandy, with its thick hedgerows and narrow lanes, created an environment that heavily favoured the defender and made anti-tank operations extraordinarily challenging. German armour, particularly Tiger and Panther tanks, used the terrain expertly, appearing suddenly from concealed positions to engage Allied armour at close range, before withdrawing, before effective return fire could be brought to bear. The 17-pounder, with its ability to penetrate German heavy armour frontally at combat ranges, became one of the few weapons Allied forces possessed that could reliably defeat these threats. The challenge in Normandy was getting the 17-pounders into effective positions and keeping them supplied with ammunition, in an environment where movement was difficult and dangerous. The guns were heavy, difficult to maneuver through narrow lanes and fields, and their deployment required clearing fields of fire through the dense hedgerows. Once positioned, however, they proved devastatingly effective. British and Canadian anti-tank units equipped with 17-pounders positioned their guns to cover road junctions and likely tank approaches, waiting in ambush for German armour. The pattern of engagement was often similar. A German tank would appear, moving cautiously through the confined terrain, and the 17-pounder would fire from concealment at close range, penetrating the enemy armour with the first shot and destroying or disabling the target before it could identify and engage the gun position. The crews who operated the 17-pounder in Normandy developed enormous respect for their weapon, and an equally healthy respect for the dangers they faced. The gun could defeat German armour, but the crew was vulnerable to infantry attack, mortar fire and return fire from surviving tanks. The 17-pounder's distinctive report and the flash of its firing revealed its position immediately, meaning that after engaging, the crew might have only seconds before German mortars or tank fire began landing on their position. Experienced crews developed drills that emphasized speed: fire, reload, fire again if necessary, and then prepare to displace if the tactical situation required it. The crew members who handled ammunition worked with desperate speed, knowing that every second counted, that a slow reload could mean the difference between destroying an enemy tank and being destroyed by it. The psychological impact of the 17-pounder on German tank crews should not be underestimated. The appearance of Tiger and Panther tanks in significant numbers had given German armoured forces a psychological advantage in addition to their technical superiority. German tank commanders had grown accustomed to engaging Allied armour from ranges where return fire was ineffective, confident that their frontal armour would defeat most shots even if they were hit. The 17-pounder changed this equation fundamentally. German tankers learned that the distinctive crack of a 17-pounder firing and the appearance of its long barrel meant they were facing a weapon that could defeat their armour frontally at combat ranges. This knowledge forced changes in German tactics, requiring more caution, more careful reconnaissance, and a reluctance to expose their tanks even in situations where they had previously enjoyed armoured superiority. There are documented instances from Normandy and subsequent operations where German tank commanders, upon identifying a 17-pounder position, withdrew rather than attempting to engage it directly. This was not cowardice but tactical prudence. A Tiger tank, despite its formidable capabilities, was not invulnerable, and exposing oneself to a weapon specifically designed to defeat heavy armour was an unnecessary risk. Some German after-action reports specifically mentioned encounters with 17-pounder guns and described them as requiring particular caution and respect. This was high praise indeed, coming from an enemy known for the quality and effectiveness of its armoured forces. The 17-pounder was also mounted in a limited number of tanks, creating the Sherman Firefly, a hybrid weapon system that combined American tank mobility and reliability with British firepower. The Firefly gave Allied tank units the ability to engage German heavy armour on more equal terms, though mounting the massive 17-pounder gun in the relatively small Sherman turret required significant modifications and created challenging ergonomics for the crew. The Firefly deserves its own historical attention, but its existence demonstrates the value that Allied commanders placed on the 17-pounder's capabilities, willing to accept significant compromises in other areas to obtain its firepower. As the Allied armies broke out from Normandy and began the pursuit across France and into the Low Countries, the tactical employment of the 17-pounder evolved. In more open terrain, with greater opportunity for manoeuvre, the gun's limitations in mobility became more apparent. It could not keep pace with rapidly advancing armoured formations, and its deployment required time and effort that was not always available in fluid situations. However, during deliberate operations, particularly river crossings and assaults on fortified positions, the 17-pounder remained a critical asset. Its ability to engage German armour at long range and from prepared positions provided overwatch for advancing forces and deterred German counterattacks. The final campaigns of the war, the crossing of the Rhine and the advance into Germany, saw continued employment of the 17-pounder in the role for which it had been designed. German forces, increasingly desperate and with dwindling resources, continued to deploy their heavy armour in defensive operations, attempting to delay the Allied advance and inflict maximum casualties. The 17-pounder crews who had survived from Normandy through to the final stages of the war were now veterans with enormous experience, capable of reading terrain instinctively, positioning their guns with practiced skill, and engaging targets with the cool professionalism that comes from repeated combat. They had learned every quirk of their weapons, developed personal techniques for faster loading or more accurate laying, and bonded as crews in the way that only shared danger can create. The human cost of operating the 17-pounder was significant, though exact casualty figures for gun crews are difficult to extract from broader casualty statistics. Anti-tank gun crews generally suffered high casualties compared to many other military specialties because they operated in forward positions, were priority targets for enemy fire, and had limited protection once their positions were identified. 17-pounder crews, because their guns were particularly valuable and therefore heavily engaged, suffered accordingly. Crews were frequently killed or wounded by enemy tank fire, artillery and mortars, and the survivors often had to watch friends and comrades die at their posts while continuing to serve their guns. This demanded a particular kind of courage, not the brief intensity of an infantry assault, but the sustained, methodical courage of remaining at one's post under fire, executing the drills and procedures that kept the gun in action even as the world exploded around you. The technical performance of the 17-pounder continued to improve throughout the war as ammunition development proceeded. The initial armor-piercing shot was effective but was supplemented by armor-piercing capped shot, which improved penetration against sloped armor, and later by armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds, which achieved even higher velocities and penetration. High explosive shells were also developed, allowing the gun to engage soft targets and infantry positions when tanks were not present. This versatility enhanced the 17-pounder's value, making it useful in a wider range of tactical situations beyond pure anti-tank operations. By the war's end, the 17-pounder with discarding sabot ammunition could penetrate over 200 mm of armor at 1,000 yards, performance that exceeded even the latest German tank armor when striking at favorable angles. The post-war service life of the 17-pounder demonstrated the fundamental soundness of its design. The gun remained in British service well into the 1950s and saw combat during the Korean War, where it proved effective against North Korean and Chinese armor. It was also exported to numerous other nations and remained in use with some countries into the 1960s. This extended service life, spanning over 2 decades from initial development, is remarkable and reflects both the quality of the original design and the difficulty of developing weapons that genuinely exceed their predecessors in capability. The 17-pounder set a performance standard that took many years for subsequent weapons to surpass decisively. Modern assessment of the 17-pounder by military historians is generally very positive, with recognition that it represented one of the most successful anti-tank gun designs of World War II. Its combination of high penetration, reasonable mobility for its power class, and reliability made it an outstanding weapon system. The decision to proceed with its development despite the size and weight penalties was vindicated by its combat performance. Some historians argue that if the 17-pounder had been available in larger numbers earlier in the war, particularly during the North African campaign, Allied forces might have suffered fewer tank casualties and achieved operational objectives more efficiently. This counterfactual speculation, while unprovable, reflects recognition of the weapon's importance. The surviving examples of 17-pounder guns can be found in military museums around Britain and the Commonwealth, where they stand as testament to the weapon's importance in Allied victory. Seeing one in person reinforces the impression of size and power that photographs alone cannot fully convey. The long barrel, the substantial carriage, the massive shield, all combine to create a weapon that looks exactly like what it was. A tank killer designed to dominate the battlefield at long range. Museum visitors often express surprise at the gun's size, having underestimated the dimensions required to achieve the performance that historical accounts describe. Standing beside a 17-pounder, one gains appreciation for the physical demands placed on the crews who operated these weapons under combat conditions. The legacy of the 17-pounder extends beyond its direct military contribution to influence on subsequent weapon design and doctrine. The gun demonstrated that dramatically increased firepower, even at the cost of increased size and weight, could provide decisive tactical advantages in anti-tank warfare. It validated the concept of the high-velocity, long-barreled anti-tank gun as a viable weapon system, despite the logistical and tactical challenges such weapons presented. Post-war anti-tank gun design built on lessons learned from the 17-pounder's development and employment. though the advent of wire-guided missiles and later technologies would eventually make large-caliber towed anti-tank guns obsolescent. The 17-pounder also contributed to the broader evolution of British military thinking about anti-tank warfare. The weapon's success demonstrated that British industry could design and produce world-class weapon systems when requirements were clear and development was properly resourced. It showed that investing in technical superiority and specific capabilities could compensate for numerical disadvantages in overall force size, and it provided British forces with confidence that they possessed weapons capable of defeating the best that enemy forces could deploy, a psychological factor whose importance should not be dismissed when considering overall military effectiveness. For the men who served the 17-pounder in combat, the gun occupies a special place in their memories and their stories. Veterans who operated these weapons speak of them with a mixture of professional respect and personal affection, the kind of relationship that develops between soldiers and equipment that they have trusted with their lives. They recall the physical demands of handling the heavy ammunition and maneuvering the gun into position, the tension of waiting in ambush for enemy armor to appear, the violent shock and noise of firing, and the grim satisfaction of seeing armor-piercing shots strike home against enemy tanks. They speak of crew members lost, of near misses and lucky escapes, and of the peculiar bond that formed among men who faced death, together behind a shield of armor plate with a 17-pounder as their primary means of survival. The story of the 17-pounder is ultimately a story about meeting a critical military requirement with technical excellence and tactical innovation. British forces facing German heavy armour needed a weapon that could defeat that armour reliably at combat ranges, and British designers and industry delivered exactly that weapon. The gun's crews needed training, doctrine and leadership that would allow them to employ the weapon effectively despite its limitations, and the British Army provided those elements through hard-won experience and adaptation. The result was a weapon system that restored to Allied forces the capability to defeat German armour that had seemed invulnerable, and that gave infantry and tank crews the confidence that they were not helpless in the face of tigers and panthers. On the battlefields of Italy, Normandy and Germany, the distinctive crack of a 17-pounder firing became a sound that both sides learned to recognise immediately. For Allied soldiers, it meant that one of the most capable anti-tank weapons in their arsenal was in action, providing protection against enemy armour and evening the odds in the armoured battle. For German tankers, it meant that an enemy gun capable of penetrating their frontal armour was present, demanding caution and respect. The 17-pounder changed the calculus of armoured warfare in the Northwest European theatre, not decisively, not alone, but significantly and measurably. It was one piece of a larger puzzle of Allied victory, but it was an important piece, and the men who designed it, manufactured it, and above all fired it in combat, deserve recognition for their contribution to defeating Nazi Germany. The Ordnance Quick-Firing 17-pounder anti-tank gun stands as one of the outstanding weapon systems of World War II. A gun that met its design requirements fully, performed reliably in the most demanding combat conditions, and earned the respect of both the forces that employed it and the enemy forces that faced it. In the history of anti-tank warfare, it occupies a place of particular importance, as the weapon that demonstrated Western Allied nations could match and exceed German capabilities in this critical area. The crews who served it with courage and skill from the deserts of North Africa to the forests of Germany created a combat record that validated every technical decision that went into the gun's design. The 17-pounder was quite simply exactly what was needed when it was needed, and in the unforgiving environment of combat, there can be no higher praise than that.